All right. Welcome, Maria.
I think I deserve a badge of courage just for making the attempt to give this talk. So I think that's why John Henry was encouraging me. And John Henry actually gave a pretty good introduction to what I'm going to do. I'm going to, the traditional defense so far has been one of approaching it from the perspective of the procreativity of the relationship between male and female as being the reason against same-sex marriage. I would like to make an attempt to approach the equation from the perspective of the unitive dimension that is normally associated with marriage. You'll see that I will bring in the procreative as well. It's going to play a very important role here too. It's of course inseparable, but I'm going to try to begin from the union. Now, I don't know whether I'm right on this, but my sense is that at least many people who advocate everything that is contingent is somehow patterned after the absolutely necessary. Okay, there's something within it that structures it that's going to be a kind of participation in the necessary. And here's the thing. The contingent realities that are closer to the necessary will have more, you could say, luminosity to the mind, will have more clarity or more certainty to them. And the farther they are away from these necessary realities, the less certainty they're going to have. So just one small example, if I take this pile of wires, I could call it a pile and say I'm creating a pile. Okay, this is a contingent thing here. But it's very far from any kind of, you could say, the laws of beauty, of order, and so forth that have their ultimate source in the being of God. Okay, so they're necessary. All right, so this is a contingent reality that doesn't have a very high meaning or intelligibility to it. Right, but there are others that have a much stronger unity to them, that are much closer to the necessary realities, and so we speak of them as highly intelligible, okay? And they give much more certainty in our knowledge of them, even though it isn't an absolute certainty, okay? So don't worry if you didn't follow this sort of methodological opening. It's not really material to the content of the argument, but I don't want, I'm not under the illusion that I can give a proof that is absolutely airtight in the logical sense. Okay. So, and I want to make one more note by way of introduction. When I first heard about gender becoming fluid and that now, I don't know, Facebook gives you an option of 6 genders or 8 genders or 12 genders, I was very intrigued. I thought to myself, oh, what would a new gender look like? So I started exploring it and I realized, actually, all they mean by that is the gender of masculine and feminine are somehow put together in different combinations. Actually, no new gender has ever been invented as far as I know. Somebody can correct me in the Q&A if I'm wrong about that, okay? It's already a little bit of an indication, okay, of something going on here that the ingredients of marriage, so to speak, aren't completely arbitrary. It's just a hint, but I did want to mention that. Okay, so I want to begin by examining 2 personal acts. And here we're going to be in the region of the of essential necessity. So there are 2 kinds of personal acts. Perhaps more accurate would be to say 2 fundamental gestures structuring personal action, rational action. The first is the going out of self in some way, bringing forth or giving. We could also speak of initiating. In all of these cases, there's a response being made of going forth, of giving, of initiating. Okay, this is a fundamental gesture that structures personal acting, and we can refer to it, give it a sort of label of spontaneity. All right, I know that sounds funny, but it's a technical term for going forth or initiating. So I'm going to stick to that term for the sake of simplicity. Now, there's another kind of gesture, another way of relating to reality, which is receiving, okay, a reception of what one encounters, an opening up of self to what one encounters, a taking in of it. Now, receptivity shouldn't be confused with passivity. All right, passivity doesn't belong as such to the personal sphere, okay, whereas receptivity does. And receptivity then is an act, and it's as opposed to passivity as is spontaneity. Now, I think these are the 2 gestures, as far as I can tell, that structure all personal acting. I think all personal acting is either a going forth, a going out, an initiating, or a taking in, a receiving, an opening of self. Okay? Now, we notice right away that these two gestures are correlative, so to speak. Okay, and in fact, they're complementary, but in a very deep way. Okay, so we can't understand complementarity in the abstract, right? Two colors might be complementary, right? But here we're talking about two personal gestures that almost seem not to be themselves without the presence of the other. Okay, so in that way, the complementarity is very deep. Each has to be met with the other in order to be fully itself. Okay, now the act of giving and the act of receiving exist nowhere in the abstract. They always exist as a particular act of giving or a particular act of receiving. And upon consideration, we find that the highest, the most intensive instance, so to speak, of the realization of these two acts is in the reality of love. The reality of love is, in its essence, structured by these two gestures, right? Love is a union that comes about, a union between two persons that comes about through the mutual giving of self and receptivity of the other. Love, then, I would say, is the archetypical instance of these two gestures. And we find that conceptually, giving and receiving are abstractions from this more primary or fundamental reality of love. Now, this highest instance of these two gestures that constitutes the union of love, this, you could say, this archetypical instance, makes evident now another characteristic belonging to the meeting of these two complementary gestures. When they meet in and through an encounter with each other in love, the union is not simply an instance of two together, as if 1 + 1 = 2. But it comprises a new reality. That is, to use a clumsy metaphor, they are more than the sum of the parts. As each person, now we're thinking of the reality of love, as each person loses himself to make a gift of himself, and is received by the other in his self-gift, the two rise to a new life that exceeds in its content what the two brought to the equation. That is, a fruit is produced in this kind of union, in this union of love. Now, when we think about it, we see that every genuine personal act or gesture of giving, of going out of oneself toward another, that is met with receiving, that is received, is fruitful in some way. We can think of every encounter of friends with each other, right? Every encounter between a mother and a child, every exchange of ideas of business colleagues and so forth, okay? We notice that there's a kind of fecundation that always seems to take place, right? Even if it's something that's not immediately evident, we see that there are always going to be traces of all three together. Okay. Now, I would like to mention something that is theological, Christian theological, that is not at all necessary to the argument. But I think it's good for Christians to bring this back way to the, so you could say, to the deepest metaphysical grounding. And we, of course, find these gestures personified in the being of God. Right? We know from theology that the Father is giving, self-giving personified, and the Son is constituted in his very being as the act of reception. And then the Holy Spirit is that fruit, simultaneously the fruit in the union between the two. And this is very beautiful to think about, that actually God as love can be explained in and through these three components of love, right? So love is constituted of these three factors or these three elements, which explains the multiplicity within the Trinity, but at the same time overcomes it, right, to constitute a real unity, right? Just as love is one, only with the presence of these three factors, so in the Trinity we find one substance that comes into existence, not comes into existence, but exists as these three elements, giving, receiving, and the fruit that comes about. Now, so I want to turn to masculinity and femininity. So we're moving on to kind of closer to our topic. Now, we've just left now the region of the absolutely necessary. Okay, all the structures that I just talked about have an intrinsic necessity to them. we're moving now into the contingent, because masculinity and femininity are an invention on the part of God. I hope to show, though, that they're highly meaningful kinds of realities. So my suggestion is that masculinity and femininity are contingent essences fashioned on the analogy of the personal acts of spontaneity and receptivity. Masculinity and femininity are not identical with spontaneity and receptivity because these are personal acts, okay? Masculinity and femininity are not acts. Now, I don't have the exact metaphysical language for this worked out, but for now, this is what I say. I would say that masculinity and femininity are a mode of being, a personal, embodied being. Now, I don't think it's possible to capture the entire content of masculinity and femininity conceptually. Okay, I think we can intuit it, but it's very difficult to put into words. But I do think that we can say with some certainty that the keynote of masculinity is spontaneity, and the keynote, so to speak, of femininity is receptivity. The masculine person, then, is a personal being fashioned in the mode of spontaneity, and the feminine person is a personal being existing or fashioned in the mode of receptivity. Man and woman both have their human essence in an identical manner, but that essence in all its dimensions is articulated along a different theme in the case of each. In the personal beings that are man and woman, the human essence is modified on all levels with something like a quality, as I say, fashioned on the analogy of spontaneity and receptivity. This quality colors their souls, it permeates their bodily being on all levels, and it structures their psyche. It also informs their individual personality, but without making it any less individual. Now, my father, Dr. Damien Fedoryka, suggests an analogy from music that I think is very helpful, okay, that helps us understand, so to speak, these three layers or dimensions of personal existence: individuality, common human nature, and masculinity or femininity. So think of, I'm sorry for those of you who aren't musicians here, but think of creating two categories of symphony in your mind, okay? One category of symphonies that's written in the key of D, and a category of symphonies that's written in the key of C. Now, since they're both symphonies, the general structure of both categories will be the same, okay? There's always a structure that makes it a symphony and not a sonata. Within both categories of symphony, each one will be different by virtue of their individual composition. No two symphonies are the same, okay? They're quite unique in their content. But all the symphonies written in D will be similar to each other in a way. They'll have the same feel or the same flavor, at least for the one who's sensitive enough musically, because they will all be organized around the same note in the scale. They'll resolve into that note and so forth, okay? In the case of a symphony written in the key of D, D will be you could say the organizing note, and in the case, it's the same thing for the one written in the key of C. And so this is, I think, an analogy to say that the human person, all right, is sort of created on the theme of either spontaneity or receptivity. So it's important to mention here that as a mode of being of a human person, masculinity and femininity leave the free personal center intact, okay? They don't determine the person to any specific acts, all right? As persons, they remain free, okay? They aren't determined in their masculinity and femininity in their actions or activities. Now, secondly, with respect to masculinity and femininity, I fully agree with Edith Stein and with Karol Wojtyła, John Paul II, that masculinity and femininity are modes of being existing already on the level of the personal soul. However, they're by nature ordained to a bodily existence, right? Angels don't have masculinity or femininity. The masculine soul is embodied, and therefore the masculine body expresses in physical form the spiritual traits of masculinity. And now we have not only masculinity, but a male person. The feminine soul is embodied, and therefore the feminine soul expresses in physical form the traits of femininity. Now we have not only femininity, but a female. This is possible because physical reality can take on forms that have an analogy with spiritual realities. Okay, Plato so beautifully explains that in the third book of the Republic. Further, masculinity and femininity now as embodied find a special culmination, a concentration, we can say, or a crystallization in bodily sexuality. We see this in the physical structure of the body of the man and the woman, and on the basis of a metaphysics of embodiment that is driven by experience, and Edith Stein speaks about this. We recognize that bodily sexuality is in fact formed from within by a spiritual soul of the masculine and feminine person, and consists in, you could say, a unique concentration of that femininity and masculinity. Sexuality, then, would also be a kind of embodiment of the two gestures of giving and receiving. As a special crystallization of masculinity and femininity, this would already indicate the ordination of this feature of the embodied person to a love relationship that is specific or restricted to a man and a woman. Now, I already argued in my first lecture that it would be a love relationship of a very deep and indeed of a very exclusive kind. So now I want to step back and reflect on why the term gender has been used to indicate the realities of masculinity and femininity. If we go back to its metaphysical foundation in love, we see that the term gender is used because it brings to mind terms that are related in that specific, magnificent way that generates new life. Only giving and receiving generate new life. In other words, generativity sheds the brightest light on the nature of the union that is constituted by masculinity and femininity, and hence they have the label of being genders. Now, we aren't in the first instance yet speaking of physical generativity. At this point, we want to focus on the deep metaphysical, spiritual, personal intelligibilities at work in the equation. But we have to very quickly turn to the body, since the sphere of bodily sex stands at the center of this love union. Now, since it does stand at the center of this love union, whatever the body adds to the equation will be seen to be part and parcel of that love. We find that bodily sex gives not only the union of love, a special, unique, you could say very deep incarnation, but that it also gives the fruitfulness of love, a unique incarnation, the coming into existence of a new human person. Love now generates not only new life within the souls of the spouses, but a new independent life, and yet flowing organically from that love. Because of the embodied person's way of being and the embodying nature of the spousal act, the body can be caught up into the metaphysical fruitfulness of love itself, participating in it, but now marvelously adding to it. So angels cannot bring new life into existence from themselves and of themselves because they have no body. Right? As creatures, they can't share their spiritual soul and they can't create out of nothing. Right? And the body gives the contingent being the possibility of somehow being the generator of new life, really from himself, from oneself. So it's the embodied love between the spouses that engenders new human life. So you can see now that I have brought fruitfulness back into the equation, beginning from the union. And I've given it a very deep metaphysical foundation, I think. So now I turn to spousal love. And here again, we're in the sphere of the contingent. I'm pretty sure that spousal love is an invention. I don't think we find spousal love within the Trinity. We find it in the relation between God and the human soul, at least. We don't know about the angelic soul, okay? So it would seem as though that spousal union, which is such a privilege for the human person, somehow depends for its existence on embodied personhood, which is very beautiful to think about. So since spousal love is at the center, really, of marriage, we have to pause over that for a bit. Okay, now you can turn over your handouts, which I've been keeping secret from you. Okay. All right, so we see here that masculinity and femininity, which is kind of in the middle of that hierarchy there, they reveal themselves in many spheres, but they become most directly relevant and most directly the matter at play in spousal love and in marriage. By now we have seen how the fruitfulness inherent to their meeting with one another, by now we have seen how they and their inherent fruitfulness in meeting with one another are a kind of precipitation, as it were, of the more primary gestures constituting love. Okay, so we have here the self-giving and receiving that's found primarily in the being, in love, and we know as Christians that it's in the being of God. Then we abstract spontaneity and receptivity, which is always, as I say, fruitful, just as is love. From there, we have masculinity and femininity, okay, as a kind of ethos that's created by God to be a reflection of spontaneity and receptivity. And then from there, we go down and we have the embodied male and female person. They are feminine and masculine in many, in their entire bodily and psychic structure. And then we have male sexuality and female sexuality, the special concentration of those. And then we have procreative fruitfulness. Okay, so I wanted to line all of those up. So I did this because I wanted to make clear the way in which male sexuality and female sexuality have everything to do with love. Okay, there's a little bit of a graphic picture of that. And that they are actually procreative in a very specific way that can't be separated from them without destroying them. So spousal love, however, is prior to sexuality. Okay, it's something that occurs first in the spirits and the souls of the man and woman. Okay, it has a kind of ordination to eventually be fulfilled and culminated in a bodily union, but its origin, and you could say its lifeblood, is in the souls. Now, I'm just going to have to be very brief, but I want to focus on what the salient features are for the argument that we have here. Okay, in spousal love, the other in his or her masculinity or femininity is a central theme. Okay, in friendships, we don't have the other as the absolute central theme in their femininity or masculinity. It always plays a role, okay, but it's not central as it is in spousal love. Secondly, there's a longing for union with the other, you could say in the very center of their being as man or as woman. The two long not just for a sharing of activities, a common life, living quarters, or even of a common project like raising children, okay? The center is really there's an I-thou relationship that characterizes spousal love. Each longs to make a kind of entrance into the center of the other person. Ultimately, there's a kind of longing for the merging of lives, a creation of a new life that's not the same one that one led before, right, through this union. And all of this leads to a desire and culminates in a desire for bodily union that alone allows for the totality for which spousal love longs, right? So deeply characteristic of spousal union is this totality, this completeness. And that's why the body then is drawn into it, because as we saw in the talk on purity, von Hildebrand shows that in this life, the only way to fully belong to another person is in and through the sexual self-giving. Now, I again suggest that this kind of love then presupposes a masculine person and a feminine person. Because in spousiality, the union of love is the theme. And because the center of the person is at issue, it makes sense that there would need to be a correspondence in the very center of the persons themselves that matches up with the gestures of love that correspond to each other, making for the uniquely close union of persons. Now, there's, of course, the question as to whether persons of the same sex can experience spousal love, right? That's a very big question, and maybe we can explore a little bit in the Q&A. And it's, I haven't explored this topic enough to know. My guess is that there are reasons to think that there can be counterfeits of spousal love. We know that counterfeits even exist in you could say, heterosexual encounters. But I wonder if, anyway, I wonder if it's going to be these counterfeits that are going to explain why persons of the same sex feel, right, that they are experiencing spousal love. But I'm going to leave that aside for now. So now we turn to the conclusion, which is marriage. Okay, now here again, marriage is not a necessary reality. Okay, it doesn't have a necessary structure, an intrinsically necessary structure. It's invented by God. It's contingent. But by now, I think we can see that it's something very highly meaningful. At least I'm going to show its connection with everything we did now up to this point to show that it's very highly meaningful. Marriage, unlike spousal love, is not a reality that has its being in and through experience. It exists beyond the experience of the couple. It's a reality that comes into existence by an act of the will of the man and the woman. Okay? It entails more. It entails the presence of God and so forth, but we don't need to address that right now. But spousal love is the interior animating principle of marriage. Philosophers could say that it's the form, the interior form of marriage. This means that if we were to ask where marriage gets its defining features, the answer would be from the nature of spousal love. Marriage raises these elements of love that are experienced in the souls of the man and the woman into the sphere of an objective public bond, which brings to completion that for which spousal love yearns, but cannot by itself, of itself, establish. And of course also protects the reality of spousal love from the changeableness of the emotions and the weakness of the will. Now, what are those features of spousal love then? We've seen that the central one is a most complete and most intimate union of persons in the very depth of their being, whereby they become one. From this, then, follow the features of permanence, of exclusivity, the obligation of faithfulness, the totality that it requires of the spouses, and as we saw the fruitfulness, or as we will see the fruitfulness and the laws governing it. Marriage, then, actually effects the fullest entry of one into the other and the closest possible union of love, of mutual giving and receiving. It actually constitutes one being of the two in and through love. And that's why Scripture speaks of the two becoming one flesh. This union, accomplished in the vows, is then consummated in the sexual self-giving of the spouses to one another. If the unity on the level of the being of the persons, okay, not just in other areas, but on the very being of the persons, so if the unity of marriage occurs on the level of the being of the persons, a true mutual entrance in love cannot occur, I claim, without the complementary structure fashioned on the analogy of the gestures constituting love. It must exist on the very level of the being of the person. So that, I think I got a little bit lost there. Let me say that again. So if marriage is a love union, okay, we know that love is constituted of the gestures of giving and receiving. I'm arguing that in order for them to really become one, in love, there's a requirement for there to be a complementary structure that actually reflects the structure of love, okay, whereby there's a unity coming from the gesture of self-giving met with the receptivity. So masculinity and femininity have many manifestations that are not directly relevant to the reality of love. Okay, we can speak of many things that are masculine and feminine, or aspects of the person that are masculine and feminine. But when we seek the ground behind the very meaning of the existence of masculinity and femininity. And we trace it back to their foundation in love. That we see that in a relationship where the heart of masculinity and femininity are at play, we understand that they alone can constitute the matter of a close union. Okay, in other words, they as defining or modifying personhood have to be at the center of the equation. That is, the complementarity of their structure of masculinity and femininity as giving and receiving shows its fullest relevance and the relationship that consists most directly and most fully in the unity constituted by the giving and receiving of one's very self to form a unity of being between two persons. So that's all for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Fedoryka, for your talk. This was very enlightening, and I very much appreciate your chart here, which is helpful and very important. I wish I had it when I was an undergraduate, when I was going through feminist philosophy. Could have helped reading interpretation of certain texts better. So my question is on that nature, given what you've highlighted. So Simone de Beauvoir, one of the great second wave feminists, in her seminal text, The Second Sex, talks about how in the relationship between male and female, male is the metaphysical given in the world, and there's that problem of contest between man and women essentially submitting to that sort of male spontaneity, right? But it seems to me, in light of what you have provided, that Beauvoir's entire idea of feminism is just now the woman to embrace that sort of spontaneity, because that's her entire, at least in my reading, in light of what you provided, the entire goal of Simone de Beauvoir's feminism is for women in her heightened consciousness to basically embrace that freedom of spontaneity or going out into the world, and that constitutes her actual freedom. And I'm wondering, would that be a fair reading of Beauvoir's entire feminism in light of what you just provided for us today?
Yeah. Wow, that's a very big question, because so my conviction is that the masculinity and femininity of a person is really a mode of being that doesn't determine them to a specific way of acting. Both men and women are called to give and to receive. And in fact, within the spousal relationship, both have to give and both have to receive. Okay, so my argument is just that what we're talking about here is a union on the level of being that requires two components, so to speak, all right, that are structured in a complementary way that it would allow for a true entrance of two persons into one another, so to speak, in this particular way. And I think what of course what Simone de Beauvoir is doing is she is completely denigrating the feminine ethos and the gesture of receptivity and everything that it entails. So that gives birth to a hatred of motherhood, of any kind of service, and so forth. So I hope I understood your question. I think that I could probably just say yes to what you're saying, but I don't want to the conclusion to be that the answer is that women are just supposed to receive and allow men to give. It's not that. I think that the destructiveness of her position comes from a kind of destruction of the entire vocation that follows from the gifts that the woman receives, and perhaps that's all I'll say for now. So yeah.
So at the beginning, you mentioned that there are folks who are homosexual and want to get married because there's a special quality about marriage. So in a conversation with a bunch of academics who identified as LGBTQ, perhaps activists, they argue that they're opposed to gay marriage and actually they want to obliterate marriage. So I was curious if you wanted to comment on that.
Oh, do I want to make a comment on that? Well, obliterating marriage is, yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's a good way for them to achieve their ends. Like, it's, and that's probably not the kind of same-sex contingent that I would be able to talk to. It would just require a kind of deeper digging than what I've done here. So, and addressing probably a lot of other things. So, yeah.
Well, thank you very much for your talk. So I want to return to this idea of the acts and how they're not really determined to just one or the other. Both can give and receive. So what's, in a way, our justification for deciding that there has to be masculine and feminine if both are equally capable of giving and receiving? Where do we find the particularity of being able to identify masculine as spontaneous and feminine as receptive? Is it only in the marital act that we see this, or yeah?
No, you know this dictum that action follows upon being. If you have a being existing in the mode of receptivity, then and if we conceive of that as a kind of, and this is where it gets difficult, a kind of quality maybe, or aura, or ethos, then everything that proceeds from that person will also be characterized, will have that aura or quality or ethos to it. Okay.
And how do I identify that?
Oh, that's a premise. That I can't actually prove, and it's the traditional way of, or put it this way, it's the traditional intuition about the nature of masculinity and femininity. So, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you again for the talk. Just a question, a little bit jumping back to some of the courses we did with Metaphysics of Gender. I think it was the first day you mentioned that this model of understanding the metaphysics of gender is very old, that it goes back quite far in the tradition. And today you mentioned the idea of physical reality taking on the form that reflects spiritual reality coming from Plato. So I was wondering if you could speak for a moment about some of the origins of this metaphysical understanding.
Oh, wow. Well, what I've done is I've actually just pulled together a lot of things, and I just sort of assembled them. And I don't know, you'd like for me to name what some of those components are and where they come from, or?
Just some of the origins. I'm thinking specifically this idea, one that popped in my mind is the idea of God the Father, God the Son, and Spirit is the Spirit.
Okay.
Is fabulous unless you reject the Filioque clause. So I'm just wondering, where some of these ideas of lining up spontaneity and receptivity with, masculine and feminine, where that evolved from.
Oh. Well, you see that even in the pre-Socratics, they will make these lists where they identify the feminine with certain things. Now, they used to, of course, identify it with passivity, and I think we've improved on that by identifying it rather as receptivity more accurately. Okay, so I say read the pre-Socratics, you'll find it already there, and then that tradition has just been kept really throughout the ages. And then, I can name somebody like Carl Stern gives a pretty good exposition in his Flight from Women, where he follows that theme. If you want to read a book, a treatment of that, read the introduction to his Flight from Women. Although there's a little bit of a weakness there because when he speaks about the masculinity, he takes its fallen traits. When he speaks of femininity, he takes sort of the redeemed traits, and with masculinity, it's the fallen ones. But still, he's following that pattern, so you could look at that. So that would be one element. I don't know if there was any other particular element that you wanted me to address.
Just some of the intellectual origins of.
Yeah.
Which that's lots of stuff.
Okay, yeah, and then of course I'm using Hildebrand's view of embodiment and sexuality, also Karol Wojtyła, John Paul II. That's going on there. Edith Stein has been a deep influence, a big influence on me. Her Metaphysics of Gender. So.
Dr. Fedoryka, I was very struck by the comment that you made at the beginning that the sort of Christian theological dimension to this is not necessary for the argument that you made. And I just wonder what you think about, I don't know, it sounds to me that this entire argument, that one would have a very hard time extending an argument for the necessity of any kind of ethical correspondence to this argument unless these modes that you're talking about were not directly rooted metaphysically in a masculine or a feminine participation in the persons of God. That otherwise, I don't know if that makes sense, otherwise it seems as if you sort of build a system for understanding masculinity or femininity in a sort of vacuum. That is a kind of mode of being without a clear explanation for its particular origin in the structure of reality. And so I just wonder, why you feel like it's sufficient to retain just a philosophical, like a philosophy stripped of the theological dimension if all of our understanding of love is fully rooted, can only be fully rooted in God, who is love himself. I don't know if that question makes sense.
Okay, I hope I can answer it. Well, here's what I'm thinking, that while ontologically or metaphysically love is absolutely rooted in the divine being, it still has its own essence that can be understood apart from understanding God. That's what I'm counting on, that people can understand the structure of love, see that it consists in giving and receiving. I'm not saying that everybody would, but I think it's pretty safe to assume that many people would. And I'm thinking that would be enough. So similar to the idea that certain moral norms can be understood, the natural law theory, for example, it's premised on the idea that through understanding certain natures in the world and their value and their goodness, we can understand what kind of claim that being makes on me and how I ought to treat it. So if I meet with a free and self-determining kind of being, it stands to reason that I can't take away their freedom by directing them to an end of my own, which is using them. Now, ultimately, of course, every moral norm is backed up by God and by his divine authority and so forth. And, Dostoevsky says if there is no God, then anything goes, right? There is no morality. So I know that there are some traditions that say that morality can't be intuited or understood or lived without the being of God somehow being present consciously to the person. But I don't think that's true. And maybe there might be a disagreement, but I think that similarly, the essence of love is something that we can know without knowing God. And that's all I really wanted to do, is to show that if you know what love is, you're going to see that these gestures structure love. And then if you can understand how this precipitates downwards and so much forms the being of the man and the woman, then perhaps you'll see some intelligibility to why, metaphysically speaking, only a man and a woman can constitute the unity of marriage. So again, we may just have a disagreement there, but that was my idea. So we have Andreas.
I just was going to ask a clarifying question about kind of the conclusion. Were you concluding specifically to something about what marriage is that would lead a homosexual union to not be able to kind of fulfill that definition? Or were you trying to conclude to some truth that would make a norm against homosexual acts? Do you see the difference?
Both, I think.
Okay, so
I mean, although I didn't per se draw an ethical conclusion, I was actually more talking about the metaphysical situation, the ordination of the sexual sphere, given its place within masculinity and femininity, and given it tracing it back up to love. I just think that metaphysically speaking, there's a clear ordination to a complementary relationship is indicated.
So could you maybe draw an ethical conclusion from that, if you think that there's a way to sort of have a norm against homosexual acts from that metaphysics?
I think so.
How would that?
You want me to do it
how
right
would that
now?
run? Yeah.
Well, I think that, but Dietrich von Hildebrand has a notion of morally relevant values, and you have something similar in Wojtyła. Like when he says the person is the kind of being that is always morally relevant. When we encounter it, a moral situation arises, okay? And I think similarly, you can say, when it comes to love and another person, this is a morally charged situation, all right? By very definition, there's going to be some norm protecting this being from what? Well, as Wojtyła says, from being used, okay? And insofar as love is about the other and about self-giving and so forth, if you sort of fabricate a situation where that self-giving isn't possible and where use is implied, then you could say, well, this is something which is forbidden. So I would probably do something like that. Does that make sense? Mm.
So I'm still formulating some of this, so forgive me if I ramble a little. But to continue that line of thought, as I understand it, you've already said that that all individuals can both give and receive, right? So the point is that the masculine, or rather the male, can both participate in that masculinity of the giving and I suppose the femininity of receiving in some way, right? It just depends on how they're doing that in a relationship. Is that correct? First off?
Yes, so it's not so much how they're doing that, it's that the structure of their being is relevant.
As far as the giving and receiving on the ontological level, right?
Yes.
But you
yes.
would have giving and receiving, for example, between two male friends. It would just be a
Yes.
different kind of giving and receiving.
Yes, it would just be, exactly.
So then, given that, I am wondering how you would come away with a kind of an actual prohibition on some same-sex sexual acts, as opposed to simply being able to say it's not marriage. It's clearly not marriage. It's not given that ontological priority because it doesn't permit an ontological unity, right, in the way that the ontologically male and ontologically female does. Mm-hmm. But it would still possibly be, it could be construed as a giving and receiving of another sort. Maybe not on the level of marriage, but where would you get the actual negative, right, the prohibitive mm-hmm. on that?
Yeah, so I would say that those kinds of acts are not unitive, and they can't be unitive because of, now I almost have to go a little bit through the argument again. If you understand that sexuality is a particular crystallization of masculinity and femininity, here I think you would have to bring in von Hildebrand's vision of sexuality that I actually talked about right on Tuesday, that it's intrinsic connection to a unique kind of love, all right, to spousal love, that I think then you could conclude ethically this is a deep misuse. And then again, going back to Andreas's question of something that has to be morally relevant, isn't just neutral and can never really just be neutral. And that's I would go along those lines. Did that help? Yeah, okay. There, now you can go away. to quote someone else. Yes, Rachel, you had a question.
So my question is, I think I heard this correctly earlier, and you can tell me if I did not, but that you would say that spousal love is not within the Trinity. Was that part of? So given that thought, and then the gift, self-gift from the Father, and then I would guess some of the thought that Jesus as man and divine would also, and I think that St. John of the Cross is the one who coined that phrase, kenosis, of course that's within theology, and within him being a close friend, I would say, of Karol Wojtyła. How do you think that works into those metaphysics then? And how would that work into the fact that there is a self-gift from the Father to the Son, also the return of gift between the Son to the Father, and how that is also a reflection of spousal love? I just thought I wanted to see if you could flesh out some thought on the spousal love within the Trinity and how that works in metaphysically, just the rejection of that. So
you're asking, just to see if I understand, you're asking for me to justify why I would say that spousality is not present within the Trinity.
Yes.
Okay. So, and that's something that anyway, if somebody wants to contribute and would know the answer to that, give a better answer than myself, please do. But I think that spousality is what's called an irreducible datum. In other words, it has its own unique essence that can't be explained in terms of anything else. It's not made of component parts, okay? It just has to be seen, you could say felt, and understood directly. And we have to encounter it, and then we say, oh, that's spousality. And there would be some work, I think, to show that, for example, persons of the same sex can't really have spousal love. It's difficult, right? Because you say to somebody, whatever it is you're feeling, it can't be spousal love. And you say, well, but it's a feeling. How do you know? And that's where it is. That's where it finds itself, is in the dimension of feelings. Although it leads to deep acts of the will and so forth. Okay, but I think that I would say, you simply, you see the especially in literature and so forth. Okay, we have so many strong exemplars of the nature of the feeling, the ethos of spousality, and it seems so much to include masculinity and femininity as the essential components. And this is orientation towards a spousal union that culminates in the bodily relationship. So I probably can't go beyond that. And then so when you see I'll give you one other feature: the specific charm that each gender holds for the other, right? By virtue of their otherness, right? The beauty charms of the man charms the woman. The beauty of the woman charms the man. You don't have those elements between the Father and the Son. Do you see? So I would say maybe, if you read some love poetry and then say, well, I can't apply that to the Trinity. I can't apply that to that relationship between the Father and the Son. So that's probably the best that I can do there. Yeah. John Henry, is this the last one then, or? Okay, we can see. Okay.
Dr. Fedoryka, I know that Dr. Wallstein, I had him for class, and we talked about why there was no spousal love in the Trinity. And one thing, too, that he said was that in the relationship in the Trinity, there is some sort of ordering, which we see when we say father and then a son. But in a spousal relationship, they're like on the same playing field kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So that was one thing that he brought up. And then, but my question was, when we, like the nature of spousal love, because a lot of people that I have talked to that are for same-sex unions still see complementarity because of the way that they kind of like spiritually express themselves, and one is in a more spontaneous way and one is in a more receptive way. And so they still really recognize like some sort of union that has to be there. Yeah. And so that's what it was so interesting to me when you talked about how love is like from God, this immateriality, but that spousal is something that's uniquely material. And what does that, like, how do we, I wanted to hear if you could say more just about, like, the importance of the material complementarity that doesn't reduce a person, kind of like that article that you had sent out about the disembodied person, that first article that we had in the thing. But it seems really important to the way that people are trying to understand same-sex unions. And so I was just wondering if you could say more about the importance of the body for a spousal love, and how you said a little bit about how there isn't totality unless this happens, but I just wondering if you could say more.
Okay. I'm wondering if I can say more too. Okay, so maybe I'll just comment on one thing that you said. I think it's very interesting that even in same-sex unions, there's an admission of the need for complementarity, right? And John Corvino says, he speaks of that. Oh, there's a lot of complementarity between him and his partner, sorry. they're kind of corroborating, right, this idea that marriage requires complementarity. I suppose, you know, the best that I could do is kind of maybe reiterate that marriage is not just any kind of love union. And I think that two men and two women can be friends precisely because both can give and both can receive, and the necessary complementarity can be there for a love union. Then there's the question of spousality, whether that specific kind of love can arise between. That's a little bit more difficult to answer, right? Because it's more intangible. But I think that if you sort of follow through with the metaphysics that I gave about the need for this complementarity to constitute love, and then if you say, and this is where I would say I have to begin from what is and argue backwards. Okay, if you're in an absolute vacuum, you probably couldn't draw these conclusions. But marriage is presented to us as a union of being, as a union of beings, as a union of being on the level of being, not just on the level of hearts, okay, not just on the level of time and so forth, but of being. Yes, it's kind of mysterious. In one way, we can't really explain it if we think about it too much, but we say, I know what that means. I become one with the person to whom I make these vows, okay? And I'm just trying to sort of plug into that intuition and say, this must be the reason that God made two complementary beings when he invented marriage. This must be the reason for it. And that there wouldn't be any marriage if he hadn't made two beings fashioned to the depth, to the roots of their being, on the analogy of these two gestures that make for love. So, and then of course with the body, I think you just have to have a strong notion of embodiment, which is not that difficult to get, which is everywhere now with John Paul II. You see what I mean? And I just say that the body is an expression of the soul, and therefore of these two gestures. And then you find its connection, special connection with love because of its intimacy. There, I think von Hildebrand is actually pretty essential. If you understand that this particular part of the body is connected with the intimate depth of the person, out of which he gives himself to another to be one with that other, well, then it can only be employed in the marriage, which is understood as a union of man and woman. Did that help a little? Yeah, thank you. Thank you.